In our gospel reading, we heard those famous words from Jesus: "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me." For those of us who come to church regularly, we've heard these words year after year, but what does it actually mean to take up our cross and follow Jesus? Some people have taken it extremely literally. The pictures appearing on the screen now are of somebody called Arthur Blessitt, who for over 50 years walked right around the world carrying a cross, as you can see, with a little wheel to make it possible for him to carry it in some fairly unusual places. And there he is in Egypt, outside the White House, and in London. And everywhere he went, he would carry this cross, and he would wait until crowds gathered, which they did, and then he would preach the gospel to them. So that's a very literal understanding of what it means to take up your cross and follow Jesus. But I don't think that's what Jesus wants from most of us. At other times in history, people have taken this in quite an aggressive military sense. The Crusades, when armies from Europe went to the Middle East to try and recapture some of the holy sites of the Holy Land, were an example where people literally took up their cross in one hand and a sword in the other hand to try and fight for the Christian faith. But I don't think that's what Jesus is calling us to do either when he tells us to take up our cross and follow him. And for some people, taking up our cross to follow Jesus seems almost a sort of invitation to a kind of masochistic version of Christianity, where we're suffering and punishing ourselves all the time. And there have been various traditions in different parts of the world and in different denominations over the centuries, where some Christians, hermits and others, have sought to look out actively for ways in which they can suffer for their faith and almost to choose and cherish those things. But is that what Jesus is calling us to a kind of masochism for him? Is that what it means to take up our cross and follow him? I don't think so. I want to look at it a rather different way today. And I want to start by looking at the choices that we make every day. Because if we're to take up our cross daily, then this isn't about some big sudden decision we make to do something dramatic and incredibly spiritual. This is about everyday decisions. So here's somebody in the supermarket. You can't get much more everyday than that. Or over this last year, for some, of course, it's not been going to the supermarket, it's been organizing an online shop. But how do we choose when we're faced with that extraordinary diversity of possibilities in the average British supermarket? So many things that we could buy. How do we choose? Well, our everyday choices tend to arise from our priorities. So our priorities might be budget. We might be trying to get our shop as cheaply as possible. It might be taste. We look for the things that we like, the things that we know make us feel good. It might be convenience. We might be looking for food that's easy to prepare, that you can just sling in the microwave or the oven. Or maybe we're particularly health conscious and we're counting calories and we're looking at what there won't be too fattening, what might be healthier for us. Or perhaps we're also thinking about issues of the people who produce the food and how they're treated. And we might decide to buy fair trade tea or coffee or sugar or chocolate or bananas. We might also be trying to think about the environmental impact of our food and the food miles and try and avoid food that has traveled from a long way across the world. So our everyday choices stem from our priorities. And those priorities in turn stem from our values. And those values might be money. We might be somebody who all the time is concerned that we don't get into debt, that we don't overspend, that we're careful and cautious with how we spend our money. Our values might be about self-care, about looking after ourselves. We may feel under time pressure and therefore want not to spend longer than we have to cooking. It may be our health that's our concern. And when we're looking for what we buy, those are our values. But there are also wider values too that we may bring into the factors when we're choosing our shopping. Values to do with justice and the environment. So our everyday choices stem from our priorities, which in turn stem from our values. But there's one more step back when we look at where our everyday choices come from, and that is our relationships. It's amazing how many of our values actually come from the most important relationships in our lives. Now, some of those will be values that were drummed into us when we were children by our parents or whoever brought us up. So our values come from those family relationships. And of course, for some people, it's not what was drummed into us, but it's rebelling against that. Our values are exactly the opposite of those of our families, because at some stage in our upbringing, we thought, I don't want to be like that. I want to be different. And today, it might be our relationships with our peer groups and our friends. And it might also be the relationships that we have on social media, through email, through our phone calls, through Facebook, through those who put pressure on us or who influence us because of what they do. So there's an example just from everyday life of shopping. Let me give you one other example. How do you vote? I don't want to answer now. I'm not particularly worried about how you vote in one sense, but how do you make that decision about who you vote for? Do you always vote for the same party? Is that something you just do without thinking about it much? Or is it something you put a great deal of care into? Our choices about how we vote, and most of us will have local elections this year in May, again, stem from our priorities. And some of the classic ones that people take into account are the NHS, the economy, education, transport, the environment, and housing. And you might mentally rank those. You might think, well, the economy is the most important thing always. And therefore, my first choice is the government that's actually going to make sure that we have a stable economy, that I have money in my pocket, etc. Or you may think education and future generations are the priorities on which you choose your votes. And those priorities, again, stem from certain values. And some of the key values that lead to our values, security. So it may be you feel that economic security or that national security, that funding the military is something important. Wealth, making sure that you are secure financially, that you're comfortably off. Health, having a good health system and health service. Nature, having a good world, the environment. Family, and also the values of nationalism. That's another value that people take into account. And obviously that was one of the big factors around the whole Brexit vote and the future, thinking not just of now, but of children, grandchildren, godchildren, nephews and nieces, and so on, the world that they will grow up into. And again, those values in turn tend to come from the relationships that matter to us and that have influenced us. So our choices come from our priorities, which come from our values, which essentially stem from our relationships. Now, what's all this got to do with taking up our cross daily? Well, I want to switch that order around and start with our relationships. What's the most important relationship in your life? Because Jesus is very clear that if we're to be his disciples, our relationship with God must come first. It comes even before our relationships with our families. Jesus famously, when he was asked when he was told his mother and his brothers were outside, said, "Who are my mother and my brothers? Those who fulfill God's laws are my mother and my brothers." Our relationship with Jesus, being caught up in the love at the heart of God, and as this picture illustrates, that love between the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, that should be the core relationship that drives everything else in our lives. And to take up our cross daily means getting our values, our priorities, and our choices out of our relationship with Jesus. So what are the core values that we find in the gospel, that we find in the life of Jesus, and particularly in the cross of Christ? To take up our cross. Well, supremely love. Love for others. That's right at the heart of Christian values. Peace, being peacemakers and peace builders. Look at the Beatitudes. Look at how Jesus sets out his values and priorities. Just are denied it daily. Humility, not counting ourselves as more important than we are, not standing on our own rights, but being prepared to put others first. Forgiveness, not holding grudges, not saying they get what they deserve, but rather saying, well, I make mistakes too. We must learn to forgive. And of course, from the cross, ultimately self-sacrifice, being prepared to go without ourselves for the benefit of others, to suffer ourselves for the benefit of others. So from those core Christian values come our priorities. And Jesus is very blunt in his call to take up our cross. He says it means to deny ourselves. In other words, not to think selfishly, not to decide selfishly, not to vote selfishly, not to shop selfishly. In all those everyday things, to put others first. Now, that doesn't mean we don't look after ourselves, because we can't look after others without looking after ourselves. And the Gospels tell us to love our neighbour as ourselves. But it means that the reason we look after ourselves is actually so we can pour ourselves out in serving others, not just because we think we're important. Others come first. And particularly in the Gospels, the kingdom values that we see in Jesus, in his life, in his teaching, and in his death, are particularly looking out for those who are on the margins, caring for victims, caring for the most vulnerable, caring for outsiders, and also, I would add, caring for God's creation. Those then become our priorities. And so when we're thinking about our everyday ordinary choices, whether it's shopping, whether it's voting, whether it's where we keep our money and how we invest it and what we spend it on, whether it's our relationships, who we prioritize, who we spend time with, whose relationships we invest in. All of those things ultimately stem from our relationship with Jesus. And they are about daily taking up our cross and following him. It's interesting that when Jesus makes this challenge to take up our cross daily and follow him, it's straight after Peter has said that he believes that Jesus isn't going to be suffering and dying. And Jesus says, "Get behind me, Satan. You are not thinking of the things of God, but of the things of this world." In other words, you've got your priorities wrong. You've got your values wrong. And it's in response to that that Jesus calls us to deny ourselves, take up our cross, and follow him. And sometimes that call will lead to suffering. So this link between denying ourselves and taking up our cross, there is a link to suffering, because our values and our priorities and our choices will sometimes be different from those that are popular in the world around us. Sometimes it may lead us into conflict with governments. For Christians in Myanmar, Burma today, where there's been a military coup, where democracy's been suppressed, where people's rights are being abused, Christians and others are taking to the streets. There are many parts of the world today, in some communist countries, in some Islamic countries, in Hindu India and elsewhere, where Christians, simply for worshipping God, for sharing their faith, for seeking to live by Christian values, may be persecuted. But we don't seek persecution. We seek simply to follow the values and priorities and choices of Jesus. And if that leads us to suffering, then so be it. And even in our so-called free Western societies, it may mean that we sometimes make ourselves unpopular because our choices, our priorities, and our values may be different from those that we're in. But ultimately, when we do this, we find that, as St. Augustine says, in Christ's service is perfect freedom. That as we deny ourselves, we're actually more free. We break free of the chains that bind us, and we're enabled to be the people God truly created us to be. As Paul put it in Galatians 2, I've been crucified with Christ, and I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. The life I now live in the body, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. So this Lent, let's challenge ourselves to look at our choices, our priorities, our values, and to invest in our relationship with Jesus, that we might reflect his values in our everyday lives.